Leland, the president is pushing ahead with efforts to include a citizenship question in the next census, even though the government, facing a deadline, began printing census forms without it. This after the Supreme Court last week blocked its inclusion. So the president taking to Twitter saying, quote, "So important for our country that the very simple and basic, are you a citizen of the United States question, be allowed to be asked in the 2020 census." Department of Commerce and the Department of Justice are working very hard on this, even today on the 4th of July. Joining us now is attorney E.J. Abt. All right, Jay, so if you would start by telling us, why did the Supreme Court come to its decision?
So the Roberts Court ruled on essentially equal protection grounds, saying that the question that adding citizenship to the census violated the equal protection of immigrants and minorities, and essentially was a discriminatory question. The rationale that the administration, through Wilbur Ross, had given was to protect rights under the Voting Rights Act, and the court found that that was very pretextual, that it was done for discriminatory purposes, and Roberts, interestingly, ruled with the other four liberals on the court, saying that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution to avoid giving minorities and other disenfranchised groups equal access to health care, to education, and that it would affect gerrymandering in drawing redistricting lines for elections. And I'm
going to get into more of that in a second, but meanwhile, the president is now contemplating an executive order to add the citizenship question to the census. I mean, first of all, he doesn't have the time, but does the president have a strong legal argument at all?
None, almost none. I think, he's showing a lot of resolve with fighting this and continuing to fight it, and that helps him with his base, and it sends a strong message to those who are here illegally to not respond to the census. But I don't think he can do that by executive order. I think ultimately the courts will decide that violates the enumeration clause. That's the clause in the Constitution that requires a census to be done every 10 years. And I don't think you can, by executive order, overrule that or the decision of the Supreme Court by just saying, by executive order, we're going to ask the question. That wouldn't stand very long. And I think there's also a problem with the fact that they're already blown the deadline for the printing the actual census to the printers.
Yeah. So, Jay, before he died, Republican redistricting strategist Thomas Hofeller, he wrote a study on how a citizenship question on the census would benefit Republican and white votes. Do you agree?
Yeah. Well, I think that certainly his study was accurate in that asking that census question would benefit the GOP because it would allow them to draw the districts a certain way and to calculate federal funding a certain way. I think the problem with Hofeller's study was that while he was still alive, he contacted the administration and told them they needed to add this question, and he contacted the Census Bureau. And when that evidence came out, I think that skewed and helped make the court's decision that this was a violation of equal protection. I do think that if you add the question, then obviously it helps towards Republicans and their voting base. But I also see a need to have the question asked. I mean, there's some need to know who's a citizen and who's not that don't necessarily have a discriminatory basis. And so I think that's what the Department of Justice needs to do.
Well, then how do you have it both ways? How do you have it both ways?
Well, that's for the courts to decide. You can't. But I do think they need to come up with a different rationale. If they're going to go back to the courts and they're going to go back to this district judge in Maryland and argue that the question needs to be asked, the DOJ's got to come up with a rational basis that doesn't discriminate. The reason why you need to ask who's a citizen and who's not, that doesn't have to deal with getting funding away or towards certain states based on resources for education and health care, that does violate equal protection. It's up to the DOJ to come up with that answer of what that rational basis is, whether it's a need to decide who goes into the military or some other, reason to decide who's a citizen and who's not, or just immigration purposes.
Or maybe
they're going to have to.
Or maybe the president can propose a different way to try to keep a tally on who's here legally and who is here who's illegal. But in the meantime, go ahead. What?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to come up with a non-discriminatory reason to do so. Right now, it appears obvious that Ross and the administration, that the reasons they were doing it was to choke off some of that federal funding for health care and education to the states where there's a lot of illegal aliens, and they're blue states like New York and California.
So in the meantime, it seems like it's purely political, perhaps to pacify his base, extend his promise to fight against illegal immigration, and to fix the problem. Yeah?
Sure. And I don't think that's, look, there is an immigration crisis that we're having, and the question is, how do you fight it? And maybe that's a rational basis to use to ask the citizenship question. But changing where the dollars go and redistricting is a discriminatory basis that the court found violated the 14th Amendment.
So even if the citizenship question is ultimately not added as a census question, the president, he wins, at least at this point, in effect, because he's still fighting the good fight.
I think that old adage, he lost the battle but is winning the war, is probably true.
Wish I heard what you said, because the producer jumped right in my ear on that crucial time. So I don't know what you said. I hope you didn't say anything bad about me. All right, Abt.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Have a great Independence Day. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.